Hello out to all you wonderful people. This is Andre, the Game Idea Guy. Thank you once again for lending me your time and your ear listening into another Gamer Thoughts discussion. And this time I decided I was going to actually make a discussion that is a reply to a comment that I got on YouTube. Actually, I think that this way it's a lot more interesting. Plus, instead of me trying to type all this out in the comments section, I could articulate it vocally and have more content for my channel at the same time. So why not do it that way? So the thing that I'm going to be responding to is a comment on the discussion that I had created, or what if Nintendo plays the power game or played the power game. Either one, same difference. You get the point. So what I am going to do is respond to John Mace, who has been a subscriber to my channel for a very long time, actually. I think he's one of the earliest subscribers I've actually had, and he has regularly commented on my channel. Like, he's a good dude to have around. Like, he's always got, even if we don't necessarily agree perspective-wise, I always respect his opinion. So, getting into that, the whole premise was me discussing what would happen if Nintendo decided they were going to push playing around with having the most powerful console on the market, or at least attempting to. So, and his comment is, they already did with the Super Famicom, SNES, N64, and the GameCube. Super Famicom, SNES became a stellar success and topped at the #1 spot for its generation cycle. And I think that is true. In the overall, I think the SNES did actually top the charts as the #1 console for the generation, with the Genesis / Mega Drive being #2 overall. But I don't think that they were that far apart, if I remember correctly. I mean, I'm not looking at the information right now, and I do believe that Genesis, or just Sega in general, had a very strong hold on the European market, mostly because of the Master System and the Mega Drive. So I want to say it wasn't too far of a difference. Plus, I also want to say that the Genesis came out close to 2 to 3 years before the SNES did. So the Genesis was originally made to compete with the Nintendo, the OG, because the Master System just didn't keep pace with it for the most part. Still think it did pretty well in Europe. It just didn't keep pace with it in the overall for the most part. Now, when it comes down to Genesis, it did keep pace with the Super Nintendo throughout the entirety of that generation, whether it was in the lead or not. And I think that they swapped spots a few times back and forth during that time period. But yeah, Super Nintendo may have won that in the overall. But I don't think that Nintendo having the more powerful platform between the two of them is the same thing as them pushing for having the most powerful, or competing for the most powerful. Because if I remember correctly, TurboGrafx 16, aka PC Engine, was still better graphically than the Super Nintendo. And then you still have to count Neo Geo, which far beyond was above anything the Super Nintendo could put out. It was already well above the level of the Genesis and the Super Nintendo. I also think that the Jaguar is that generation, or is it? No, I think Jaguar is the 5th gen, not 4th. So I may be wrong on that one. But yeah, as far as it being better than the Genesis and a couple other devices that came out during that time frame, yeah. But I think that was more so due to time and when they released the Super Nintendo. It wasn't down to them trying to be or have better hardware than Sega. It came down to, it just happened to be that the prices for everything that they needed came down, or the prices of everything that they ended up using were decent enough for them to make the Super Nintendo, and it was just inherently better hardware than the Genesis at the time, because hey, that's what the prices were. That's why we ended up with so many revisions of the Genesis, though, too. Like, you ended up with there were actually 2 revisions of the original Model 1. And then there's the Model 2 and then the Model 3. So, yeah, Genesis had a bunch of revisions to kind of smooth out some things. But in the overall, yeah, Super Nintendo was definitely a more powerful machine and more popular. But I think it really just comes down to it was more popular. Now, moving over to the 5th generation with the N64, it did fairly well, and yeah, it was the most powerful overall console. And you could make an argument to say that the Sega Saturn beat it in several different places. I mean, they were both far and above as far as the hardware is concerned, way over the PlayStation if anybody actually went down into the technical details. And I mean, I have done it several times and did some research on each of these platforms. So I know for a fact that, yeah, 64 was more technically hardware efficient than both of them. And having the cartridges allowed for everything to work at a much faster pace, but it also cost them way more to get the games together. And on top of that, their file sizes were much smaller, which meant that they didn't have as much space to put stuff together. That's why they were trying to introduce the 64DD to have their own disk-based drive for their system. It just didn't take off in Japan. I still think that they should have released it over here to see how it would have done, because you never know. Like, it might have done very well over here, and I think that might have been a mistake on their part to not even at least try to see where it went. But for the most part, I think really the Game Boy Color is, and it's been handheld for a long time, where Nintendo really shined a lot for most of these generations. And the Game Boy Color definitely did that for them during the N64, as far as like hardware and software sales. So they weren't hurting. And on top of that, they were coming off the failure of the Virtual Boy, which was supposed to be their third pillar at the time, and it just didn't do well, for a multitude of reasons. But the N64 introduced us to a lot of stuff that will go on to every other platform. So I don't think that, even if they didn't take the generation, because clearly the PS1 did. PS1 definitely took that generation. Sega Saturn was behind. I think Sega Saturn was in 3rd place. Then you had the 3DO and the Jaguar, which I don't even think really registered all that high. And a couple others that I don't remember the names of. I just know they existed. But that's how it happened. So, during that generation, I don't know if Nintendo was necessarily worried about pushing to be the most powerful. I think in this situation, they just happened to be the most powerful. Like, they were just trying to figure out what worked well and what could move them into 3-dimensional spaces. And that's what they went with. Whereas Sony and Sega maybe pulled back on the graphics a little bit and went heavier on how the software was to be utilized. At least that's what I gathered from how they've done things. Now, GameCube, I will give it to you. GameCube, they wholeheartedly went to push to be one of the better platforms as far as hardware is concerned. So I would say that, and I didn't even fully read your comment. I'm sorry about that. Because you said the N64 was okay, neither good or bad, ended up being decent, was in the middle. Yeah. And then GameCube had a library filled with games that were critically acclaimed, but the sales of the console itself was a fail, relatively speaking. Yeah, relative to the N64 or the Super Nintendo, definitely. But in general, not really. They still made a profit off of the console itself. They made a profit off of the software itself. But during this generation, they also had the Game Boy Advance. And the Game Boy Advance was selling gangbusters and making them a lot of money. So still, and yeah, Sony really sold PS2s based off of that DVD player. Because there were people that weren't even gamers buying PS2s. Because it was the cheapest DVD player on the market at the time. And it just had a bonus feature for them that it could play video games so their kids could use it. And I think this is right around the time that parents stopped saying, oh, you playing those games on my TV is going to mess it up. I still remember hearing that phrase when I was younger. That aside, just that note in history to me would always be funny because I'm like, how? This is a side note. I'm like, okay, me playing a video game on your TV is going to mess it up. Wouldn't hooking up a VCR, for all those kids that don't know what VCRs are, they had tapes, cassette tapes, that they played videos on. That was before DVD. But it's like you running them games on my TV is going to mess my TV up. I'm like, y'all just don't want to say you don't want us on the TV. You want the TV, you don't want us playing a game on it. That's all you had to say. That's all. Coming up with that, this game is going to mess with my TV. Like, well, the VCR would, laser disc machines would, because they existed back then. Gosh. All this stuff that people hooked up to their TV, all of that would have been ruining your TV. It would have been degrading it over time anyway. Sitting and watching game shows and soap operas and late night TV, all of that stuff would degrade your TV anyway. So it was just funny to think about. That's what parents used to say back then. I'm like, how? How does a game console? Or, well, we didn't say console back then. We used to just say system. How does a game system mess up your TV? But that little side note pushed away. Because again, parents kind of forgot that the PS2 was a game console rather than a DVD player. And they used it for the DVD playing function. And their kids just got the bonus of having video games added to it. That's how that ended up happening. And that's why Sony was so successful with the PS2. But yeah, and for that generation, besides the Dreamcast, because the Dreamcast went off the market way early, yeah, the PS2 was the weakest hardware-wise out of the big three. Because GameCube and Xbox were pretty comparable. Even though one was stronger in some places than the other was, and vice versa, they were pretty comparable to each other. But Sony was like a decent drop-off from them. And you could see it in a lot of the games that were cross-platform for all of them, especially in games like Soul Calibur 2. Whereas on the PS2, you had these muddy textures, and like I can't really describe it, but it was like the image would leave a trail behind when you're playing on the PS2 to an actual CRT TV, old school tube TV. You could see like a trail behind the characters, like it wasn't keeping up with the movement of the game. Whereas watching it on GameCube and on Xbox, I never saw that, and it looked smoother on both of those. And I think that was mostly because Sony probably wasn't their original target platform for it. They might have started off on the GameCube or the Xbox first, then moved over to PS2 because they were like, oh, look at them sales. We got to throw a character in here and put this on that console. We'll give him Heihachi, even though he's not really technically a first-party Sony character. Same thing with Spawn, because he was technically not a first-party character for Xbox. The only one that had a first-party character was Nintendo, and that's why theirs sold the best. But getting back to the point, GameCube was damn near everything that third-party developers had asked Nintendo for. It was great in the hardware department for the time. The mini DVDs allowed for better protection against piracy. And on top of that, it was cheaper to develop for. If I remember correctly, I think the GameCube was actually cheaper to develop for than the PS2 was. I mean, I could be wrong, so don't quote me on that. But if I remember correctly, it was. And that's why Nintendo didn't really push the idea of trying to be the most powerful console when it came around to 7th generation. That's why they moved over to the Wii instead of doing something like the Wii U instead of the Wii, which would have been astronomically more expensive at that time. They made the Wii. They took a concept that they were trying to implement on the GameCube anyway and built a whole platform around it and motion controls. And it opened up gaming for a lot of people that wouldn't have been gaming in the first place. So all those people that were the people that were purchasers of the PS2 just simply for the DVD player were also people who would have bought the Wii to play video games that they could not play anywhere else because the controls were not there for them. So, I mean, I would say that their philosophy, for the most part, has stayed relatively the same. It's just been different implementations of it. Because I don't think that for the Super Nintendo, they were like, okay, we have to make sure that we have a more powerful console than the Sega Genesis. Because at the time, they were still competing very well with the NES. I think it was just, okay, there's more we want to do with our games. We need better hardware to do it. And they happened to end up with better hardware than the Genesis at the time because the parts were cheaper. The hardware that would make their system in the overall better, they were cheaper than when Sega initially put together the Genesis. And I would also say it's the same thing for the N64. It just came down to we need better hardware to pull off the things that we want to do in these games. And doing the 3D space, I mean, they kind of already got there with the SNES with Star Fox. But they couldn't take it to the level that they wanted. So that's when the N64 rolled around. The GameCube was more or less just an evolution of the idea of the 64. So you really did make me think through this, though. That was why I was like, this would be a long, arduous read rather than me just talking about it and posting the video maybe a day or so later. So that's why I was like sitting there thinking, I was like, I could sit there and write this all out, but I was like, nah, that would take way, way longer to do. And I do think that talking about it and discussing it in this way gives it more breadth to more people. Now, a Nintendo pushing for power right now, they could definitely do it, despite what a lot of people might think. They've got the money to do it. But if they put that money into it and it fails, that cuts a huge amount of cash out of their pockets that they could use for other stuff. And I don't see them pushing that just to do it. Because even if you think about it, the Wii U was a push for power. And I've said it so many times, but people don't, it's like the majority of people don't understand this. I know a lot of people listening to my channel, at least the people that come back, understand this, that the Wii U was out before the PS4 and the Xbox One were announced, before they were conceptually shown. The Wii U had been released. That's why, and people won't look at it like this, but that's why Microsoft came out with Smart Glass for the 360 and the Kinect for the 360, because they were trying to compete with what Nintendo was doing. And you could make the argument that Sony had already kind of done this second screen thing with the PS3, but Nintendo had already done that with the GameCube. So it was kind of already, they had already done it with the GameCube and the Game Boy Advance. But it's like Nintendo went to push a platform, because if you look at the Wii U in comparison to the 360 and the PS3, there's no reason that Wii U games during that time frame should have had as many issues as they did. Especially when you hear developers say, hey, the game, this console is comparable to the 360, and that's our favorite platform to develop on. So if it's comparable to the 360, but you know, it has, what is this? 8 times, not 8 times, like at least 4 times the RAM. Actually, yeah, 4 times the RAM in it. And on top of that, the space on the console is easily expandable. It runs things more efficiently, and on top of that, it fulfills the promises the PS3 was supposed to fulfill by giving you 2 screens to game with on a home platform. You would think that this would have been one of their favorite platforms to work with. I don't know. Part of me thinks, and just having looked over a lot of stuff, that the reason Nintendo wouldn't be successful with a more powerful platform has nothing to do with the power of the platform. And it has more to do with past dealings with company heads at Nintendo and third-party developers, not developers, publishers wanting to swing things more in their own favor. But the thing is, you never see many of these third-party publishers make their own gaming platform. And the ones that do it on PC, so they don't have to manage the hardware. Because if they had to manage the hardware with the requirements that they set, they would scale their stuff back a lot. Just imagine what an EA console would look like, or an Activision console, or a Ubisoft console. Imagine what those would be like. I can, and it ain't pretty. And there would be a lot of quote-unquote weak hardware out there if these companies had to manage their own hardware to put their games out. At least that's my standpoint on it. People can disagree with me on that. And I know that that's a tangent separate from what the actual subject was, but it was something that I think enhanced it just a little bit. But that said, I think I've run this discussion long enough. So thank you guys very much for listening in. Keep your eyes and ears up for more stuff from me. And until the next time, enjoy your games and peace out, everybody.